They'll know who you are. They'll know what you meant. They'll know what was important to you, and you will be remembered.
Welcome to Price Discovery, Money and Mindset. Go under the hood with Jordan Rodriguez, a certified financial planning professional and certified exit planning advisor, as he explores the art of balancing wealth with personal fulfillment. We'll hear strategies and stories from industry experts, business owners, and thought leaders about navigating the complexities of high net worth families and businesses. Without further ado, here's Jordan Rodriguez.
Hello, friends, and welcome back to Price Discovery, Money and Mindset. Today's guest is Dan Nigito, CEO of American Philanthropic Advisors and author of The Power of Leveraging the Charitable Remainder Trust. We cover the main topic of how to avoid becoming an accidental philanthropist. If you don't know what that means, make sure that you tune in. In addition to what we talk about, I'll include some white papers in the show notes, as some of the topics that we discuss get pretty esoteric and involve some visuals and math I think you'll find really appealing. Enjoy. Dan Nigito, thank you so much for taking the time this morning. Really excited to have you on the podcast. I heard you at a speaking engagement. This must have been a few years ago. You were on stage with Michael Kitces. And don't get me wrong, I love Kitces. I listen to his podcast every week, but you stole the show. You were super engaging. You're passionate about the topics that you talk about. And today's theme is going to center around charitable planning. We'll take it in a number of different directions, but you had this phrase that I hadn't heard anywhere else, but I've seen pop up since: accidental philanthropy. What does that mean?
Thank you. Thanks for having me on, by the way. I mean, this is great. And you're right. I talk about this stuff in my sleep. This is like all I do. Well, let's start off by saying this. Everybody can identify who a philanthropist is because you go to colleges and you go to hospitals, their names are on the sides of buildings and they name wings after them, libraries. So people think of philanthropist as the guy who writes the big check, gives the big money. But any act of giving is philanthropy. What you do at church, what you do to the United Way, anything you do is, when you give money, it's considered philanthropy. But sometimes people take your money on your behalf, and that's called taxes. And taxes is when the government, through some form, reaches into your pocket, takes your money, and then, and here's the key, gives it away to the programs that they want to give it to. Are you giving money away? Yes. You're just doing it accidentally. Is it going to the things you want to support? Probably not. So accidental philanthropy really is my way of talking about income taxes, capital gains taxes, taxes on dividends, God forbid, estate taxes, and capital gains, I think, is the most obscene of them all. And now taxes on your IRA distributions. And my all-time favorite, so you get me worked up. I shouldn't really do this first thing in the morning, but my all-time favorite is required minimum distributions from a retirement plan is the most obscene way of attacking baby boomers like me, forcing people to take money out of their IRA when they probably don't want it, many don't want it, forcing you to take money for the sole purpose of paying tax on it, and then taking that money and giving it away. So that makes you an accidental philanthropist. You're giving money away and you don't even know about it.
Sure. Now, one of the questions I had for you was how taxation affects wealth accumulation, but you just hit on it. You named all of the different forms of taxation that we run into on a day-to-day, month-to-month, year-to-year basis. I think the next natural place to go is how the current tax system influences the behavior of investors, business owners, anybody who ends up paying taxes.
Well, it's funny. I refer to this as a war on wealth, but it's really a war on accumulated wealth and the war on the transfer of accumulated wealth. As you build money, assets up. Okay, let's do it this way. First, you earn money, you pay income tax. Then, because you care about the country and you care about business and you're a capitalist, you take some of that money and you invest it. And you buy securities, or you put some money away in your IRA or 401k. And then you build that money. And at some point, you decide to sell the investment and put it someplace else, invest it someplace else. We build the asset up, we sell it to reinvest it elsewhere, and then we have to pay capital gains on that. You have a
Sure.
partner in the government, and you didn't ask them to be your partner. They don't participate, by the way, if you invest in something and the value goes down. They don't give you their 30% of that back, but they will take their piece going up. So you reinvest it, you have to pay capital gains tax. Maybe you earn dividends, you pay tax on that, and then you die. And when you die, you get to pay more tax on the transfer of that wealth from you to the next generation. So the impact on investors is that they tend to hold on to assets too long. How many times do you talk to people and they say, well, I'd like to diversify, but if I diversify, I'm going to, especially in this environment, the people have had a nice run up for the last couple, 3 years. Well, I would like to diversify, get out of some of these tech stocks. But if I do, I'm going to get crushed. I'm going to get crushed in capital gains tax. 23.8% of my gain goes away. So they tend to hold on, and then they hold on, and they hold on, and then as things start to go down, and it kind of takes care of its own problem. That's where what I refer to as strategic philanthropy. That's where that comes in, because that provides us an environment where we can keep our winnings and invest them without having to pay those capital gains taxes.
Sure. It's a natural transition. You're doing my job for me. We're not here to talk about taxes, Mr. and Mrs. Listener, believe it or not. We're here to talk about charitable planning. But you can't really talk about charitable planning unless you have the tax conversation ahead of time. So in a nutshell, what is charitable planning? I know it's a loaded question.
That is a loaded question. I'm going to take your question and I'm going to twist it just a little bit.
Sure.
Into what I call charitable leverage or strategic philanthropy. And so what that is, and let me just backtrack and say that before you do anything, you have to have it in your heart to want to do something good. So we all have people we owe, institutions we owe. It could be a place where you practice your faith. It could be your college. It could be, again, the United Way. It could be anything, any number of places, things that are important to you, charitable entities. Maybe you sit on the board of a foundation. Maybe you sit on the board of, maybe you're a trustee somewhere, or maybe you just feel something for an organization. You have to have it in your heart to want to benefit somewhere, that benefit those foundations, those organizations. So what strategic philanthropy or charitable leverage does is it says, okay, there are tools out there that allow you to take assets that are exposed to accidental philanthropy and shift those assets into specially designed trusts that will benefit the charity that you care about. So you're going to take accidental philanthropy and convert that into intentional philanthropy. Instead of giving money to causes I don't care about, I'm only going to give money that I would have lost in taxes. I'm going to give that money to the causes I do care about. But before I give that money to those causes, I want to benefit myself and my family. And so there are things called charitable remainder trusts, charitable remainder unit trusts, and charitable remainder annuity trusts. Charitable remainder trusts that allows you to take an appreciated asset, put it into a trust, designate that money someday is going to go, that asset someday is going to go to charity. But between now and that day in the future, I'm going to benefit, and my family's going to benefit from how that trust performs. And I'm going to get, when I set up a trust like that, it's going to allow me to take an appreciated asset, place it into the trust, sell it inside the trust, and reinvest it without paying any capital gains tax. Box number one. Box number two, I could take that asset, reinvest it, and draw a significant amount of income from that trust. So I'm going to take an asset, avoid capital gains tax, increase income on it. And then box number 3 is, because I'm so smart, I'm going to get an income tax deduction for doing that. I mean, think about this. I'm going to avoid the tax on capital gain, increase my income, and get a tax deduction that I can use against other ordinary income. And I can use that against 30% of my adjusted gross income, and I could carry it forward for 5 years. And I didn't just think of this overnight. This is 1969 tax law. This came out of the Tax Reform Act of 1969.
Yeah.
It's a long time. There's billions of dollars that have been shifted into charitable remainder trusts. The key to the charitable remainder trust, the catch, if you will, is that when you put the asset into the trust and you get the tax deduction and bypass the capital gains and all that new income, eventually, when the trust ends, it has to go to the charity that you designate. But then again, you have a little bit more flexibility there because you can pick and choose the charity. You can change the charities along the way, and you can even create your own charity to receive the benefit. You can go in your town, and anybody who's listening, their town, they have donor advised funds. You can create your own donor advised fund. You can go to all the wirehouses now, the investment houses, Schwab and Fidelity, they all have their own versions of charitable gift funds. You can take the asset that you were going to lose the taxes, push that asset into a donor advised fund. You get to suggest where that money goes every year, and your family stays involved after you're gone. So it's a multi-generational situation, a lesson on philanthropy. So I have no idea what the question was, but that was my answer.
I mean,
forgot what the question was.
You laid so much on the table, and if you're listening, we're going to go through everything that Dan just said kind of in more detail. I'm going to give him some scenarios. We're going to talk through some of the logistics, but that's a great teaser into really the meat and potatoes of what we're talking about today, a charitable remainder trust. But I want to key in on something that you said before we actually discuss the CRT. You mentioned that you need to have that giving in your heart. So you're telling me that strategic charitable planning and charitable leverage isn't a cheat code. It doesn't mean that we're just going to get to avoid taxes completely. There has to be some component of giving that's innate or motivating us to begin with.
Yeah, it's essential. It's essential, and I'll tell you why. There's a lot of tax shelter mechanisms out there that are great. I don't use any of them because I don't know enough about them to be effective. But the tax incentives of charitable giving are there because of charitable giving. You know, once a year you have to file your tax returns, and there's an addendum you put with your accountant has to put with your return that shows you what the charitable gift is, where it's going, how it's being used. And there's also some guidelines. You know, you can't get crazy. You can't give. There's restrictions on how the gift is structured. So you can't set these things up where there is virtually no gift remaining for charity. There has to be at least 10% of what you put in has to be there at the end for charity. There's ways of doing those calculations. Young guys like you can't even do them. You're too young to do them unless you do one that's structured over a term of years. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of guidelines that we use for people who have want to take advantage of the tax benefits, but it really starts with the need to want to do something relatively fantastic for charity, albeit as you're going to do it with taxes, with money that someone else was going to take from you and give it away. So I mean, that creates you can create charitable incentive by just looking at what's going to happen to your money when you die, or not even when you die, while you're alive.
Yeah. Now we're going to take one stop again before we dive into the logistics of the CRT, because you're bringing up a lot of really good points. This is a future planning tool. Who needs to be at the table if we're discussing whether or not a charitable remainder trust is a good fit for a client? Because it sounds like there's some complicated tax nuance and just future planning involved.
That is a great question. We all run into clients who want to do it themselves, that they don't want to necessarily use advice of others. In a situation when you're going to use some form of charitable leverage, you really need to have a team. You don't have to spend a lot of money on it, but you do need to have a team. So who needs to be around the table? Great question. You and your spouse, if you're going to use it, if you're going to do two of you are going to participate. Your accountant is a key player because they know where the bodies are buried. They know how your taxes are laid out. Now, I'm not saying you want to go to them for necessarily to get the blessing on this thing. What you want to do is make sure that they're in on the design of it. They understand the design of it. I'm a certified financial planner. You're a certified financial planner. Financial planners bring that extra thing to the table that they're looking at the total client, the total picture. So you want to have that guy designing the plan for you. Now, sometimes the financial advisor, the financial planner combines investments and insurances, things of that nature. That's tremendous. You want to have that. So if you could have that guy, guys like you and me have to be the quarterback of that team because you need to design that program. And then there's so many twists and turns in designing a charitable remainder trust to be effective. For example, I mentioned the tax deduction and the income features of a charitable remainder trust. The more tax deduction you want, the less income you receive. The more income you want, the more the tax deduction goes down. You need a guy like you, a guy like me, the planner, to be at that table with you. Now, do we need to have an attorney there? Eventually. But because you need to have the documents, a legal document.
Right.
But you should know this. All the documents that you need are available from the IRS website.
Sure.
They tell us these documents fly, and if you don't see it here, don't use it. These are the agreements that you should use. Does that mean you should download it and write your name in and it's good? No, but I would certainly save myself a lot of billable hours by looking at that document, understanding I could do a one life unit trust, a one life annuity trust, 2 life trusts, term of years trusts. There's all these different things, and every one of them, you can go to irs.gov and you could download the document, look at that, take that with your attorney. So does the attorney need to be around the table? Yes, eventually, but not initially. I would say the key people around the table initially, well, the very key people are the advisor, the financial advisor, the planner, and the client. Then you want to bring the CPA in right at the beginning, maybe after the first or second meeting, so that the CPA is part of the planning team and can tell you, well, the taxes are not as big a factor as tax deductions are not as big a factor, but the income is nice. So now you got some design structuring you can do with the help of the CPA. I always love the team. And by the way, when you meet with a client, when you set these up and you talk to people, the advisors like to be part of a team. They like to be, as long as they're brought in at the beginning. What they don't like is somebody coming into their office and saying, "Hey, why didn't you tell me about this? This is a great thing, and here's what we're gonna do." And then they have to shoot holes. They have to tell you what's wrong with the program. Bring them in at the beginning. They become part of the planning process, and everybody benefits. Primarily the client/donor and the charity.
Sure. Well, I'm going to boil it down into 2 simple terms, so don't get mad at me. But based on your initial description, it sounds like a charitable remainder trust has some form of upfront tax benefit. We'll talk about a couple of those different potential tax benefits, an ongoing benefit of income to the donor or beneficiaries of their choosing, and then an eventual benefit to the charity. I want to isolate those three and talk about them separately.
Yes.
And I guess I'll kick you a scenario. We've got a lot of business owners that are listening to this podcast. Let's talk about the business owner who is facing an imminent exit. They're planning with their team. They've got their appraisal. They have an offer on the table to sell their business for $10 million. They have a decent chunk of outside assets. They've gone through the retirement planning, life after business analysis, and can provide themselves with a decent level of income. They're checking a lot of these financial boxes. One of the things they aren't super keen on is, let's just assume in this example, they've got $0 in basis on the business that they're selling. So all that $10 million gain is going to be taxed as a capital gain. They have some wiggle room. They don't need that entire $10 million windfall because, again, they have outside assets to live on. So they're looking at a charitable remainder trust. What benefit could a charitable remainder trust provide them on day one of, post-business sale?
Okay. Enormous benefits, but I got to take a step back. The biggest pitfall of a charitable remainder trust is waiting too late to set one up. Here's where the IRS has a hard line. If you have an offer in writing to sell, too late, because the IRS says, well, you're just doing the charitable remainder. They don't know you. And of course, they're the government, so they assume the worst. They're saying you're setting up a charitable remainder trust, not to give a gift, but to avoid paying taxes. So it's very, very important your clients understand that they can't have anything in writing. Now, they can have a lot of people sniffing around and looking at the business, and that's a great time to set up the plan. But when they have a written offer on anything, it's too late, especially when you start dealing with closely held businesses. So let's just say, for the sake of argument here, on this $10 million example, the donor doesn't have an offer in writing yet, but he has a couple of opportunities. And by the way, he doesn't have to put the assets into the charitable trust right away. He can wait until things get a little warmer, but before there's something in writing.
But it really just is, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but it really harkens back to your concept of bring the advisor in early.
Yes.
Because these are the types of things that you need to be prepared for, kind of similar to like a 1031 exchange type deal. If you don't do things properly and you press that button and the sale happens, all the potential tax benefits that you could have had fly out the window.
I had literally had it happen yesterday. I had clients of mine who've been clients of mine for many, many years. Actually, there's second generation. Built up a fabulous company. Well, we were just doing our regular review, personal assets, corporate assets, that type of thing. And they dropped a bomb on me that they're saying to me, well, we got to tell you, we've got a couple of people now who are thinking of buying us out. I said, how much are they thinking about it? Well, we're just talking. That's right. That's when you step in and plan, because that's when you have to put this on the table. I can't wait to get back to them and tell them this program. But the assets has to be inside the trust when the sale takes place. And again, I hate to get into the weeds too much, but I do want to say this. You can be your own trustee of your trust. However, you also have the right, and this makes a lot of sense, and this is, again, the role of the financial advisor is key. You can be your own trustee, but you can also appoint, and you should appoint, what's called a limited power trustee, whose only role is to sell the stock to an outside buyer. IRS loves that because that gives the trustee, it creates a barrier between the trustee and the donor, the guy selling the stock. And the trustee says, I could sell this to anybody I want. I happen to want to sell it to company B, and that's all cool. So, and then when the sale is completed, he's done.
Sure. And that wasn't too much in the weeds. I completely derailed you. The original question was the upfront tax benefit, given all the proper planning was done ahead of time, if this business owner has some potential upfront tax benefit.
Okay. So wait till you hear this. You're going to love this. Transfer some of the stock into the trust. Whatever you transfer into the trust, when it's sold when it's sold to the seller, that avoids long-term capital gains tax. Then the tax deduction from transferring some of the stock into the trust helps you wash the tax on what you sell outside the trust. How cool is this? So
It's
you've got,
huge.
yeah, it's very cool. You've got cash flow and from the trust, and then cash outside the trust, and you're using the tax deduction from the trust to wash the tax on the assets outside the trust. And then you could take some of the brand new income generated by the trust, and you use some of that income to buy insurance. And insurance is not a bad thing. Insurance is a great thing. It is the perfect component to a charitable remainder trust, because you take some of the brand new cash flow, you use that to buy insurance, second to die insurance, or if you can. And when the part in the trust that goes to charity, that second to die insurance replaces that value back to the heirs. And it can also equalize the estate to the people who are in the business versus those who are out. So tax deduction, bypass capital gains, obvious. Tax deduction helps wash the tax of some of the stock outside the trust. And don't forget, you use that against 30% of your adjusted gross income, but you can carry it forward for 5 additional years. Brand new cash flow helps to fund tax-free insurance to replace the assets that you put in the charitable trust that are going to charity. And at the end of the day, the charity could be your own family foundation, or it could be your own donor advised fund. I mean, come on, this stuff is too cool. I should be wearing shades when I'm talking about this.
Who thought that charitable planning was so cool and savvy? So in that example, let's say that, and this is a pitfall that I've run into just in the initial conversations with a client who wants to utilize something like this. There's maybe a misconception just prior to the education that if in that example, $5 million of that $10 million business goes into the trust, client potentially thinks that that means they get a $5 million tax deduction. Can you go through what the IRS discount rate is and how that affects the tax deductibility? And I don't need like real-time numbers or anything like that, but just directionally how that affects.
Yes, sure. Generally speaking, the tax deduction is really based upon a couple of factors. First, how much money do you want out of the trust? How much cash flow? The least amount of money you can take, and let's say we're dealing with a unit trust where you get a fixed percentage of the fair market value of the trust each year. So if I put $1 million in and I want a 5% distribution, that's $50,000 a year income. 5% is the minimum amount of distribution you can take out of a trust. And you can keep going up and up and up and up and up until, well, technically you could take the number is 50%, but that never works. You can keep taking more and more income until the tax deduction that you derive from that income hits 10. And then that's the cap. So usually it's usually between 5 and 9%. So factor number one is, what is the distribution rate? What percentage do you want? Factor number two, major factor, is your age. Your age or the age of your combined spouses if it's a 2-life trust. Why? Because the IRS is doing calculations on tax deductions based upon when we can assume charity is actually going to receive the money. So if you're in your 60s, 70s, which by the way, 60s and 70s are the best sweet spot. That's the age that these things are incredibly powerful. If you're in that age, then there's life expectancy tables that work out enough that there's a reasonable assumption that charity is going to get their money in 25, 30 years. If you're too young, and then too young means usually 40-ish and younger, the grid is too long. The life expectancy table is too long, and it causes the IRS to short circuit. And so you can't get enough tax deduction because there's too long of a period before charity gets their money. So how much money do you want? How old are you? Now there's a way to get around that age thing, and that
Sure.
is to
We'll talk
create a
about that.
term
Yeah.
of years. And then the third factor, so we have age, income, and the third factor is a discount rate that's given by the government each year called the 75/20 rate or the applicable federal rate, AFR it's called. What it really is it's a rate that the government assumes that you could earn on money that if you invested it in midterm bonds. It's 110% of the midterm rate. The higher that rate, that's income you give up by investing it into a charitable remainder trust. So the higher that rate is, the greater the tax deduction will be because you're giving up more. So a few years back, when the Fed in their wisdom decided to destroy interest rates and they brought everything down to about zero, that rate went to under 1% at one point.
Yeah.
And it really killed the tax deduction. Fast forward to today, what an environment to do it today, because that rate is now 5.4%. So that's one of the high, it's just the highest it's been in 10, 12 years. So that means that the magic combination is if I take 5% on my money as a return, and I'm older, and those two factors combined with the AFR, I'm going to get a huge tax deduction. Now, what is a huge tax deduction? In the best case scenario, you're probably looking at about 35 to 45% of what you put into the trust. We tend to typically see 30 to 40% of what I put in. That's going to be my tax deduction. And then I can apply that against 30% of my adjusted gross income.
Perfect. So I love using real numbers, and I'm just going to highlight a couple of the things you said using the example that we talked about. $10 million business sale. Let's say $1 million or 10% of that business stock was put into the charitable remainder trust. In this current environment, let's say this person's in their late 60s, and just so that everybody knows, these aren't real numbers, but they're going to be directionally applicable here. So 10% or $1 million of that stock is sold, capital gains tax free. You get let's just call it $350,000 tax deduction from that $1 million that was put into the charitable remainder trust to offset the taxes, the capital gains taxes that you're paying on the other $9 million. And then in this example, we're using a 5% income payout. Roughly $50,000 is going to be paid out from that trust to you as the beneficiary over the life of that trust. And we talked about, and I think now is actually a good time to jump in. I don't want any 40 some odd year olds who are listening out there to think this isn't a tool for me, because I know some 30 and 40 year olds who are selling businesses. They're coming into windfalls, selling stock options for startup companies and everything. Can you talk about the limit that you can put on the term instead of first or second to die that makes these trusts viable for a younger person?
Yeah, and I actually happen to like using these a lot. These are called term of years trusts. A term of years trust, it says that I'm going to put an asset into the trust today, and it's going to go to charity at the end of a specified number of years. The longest that number of years can be is 20. So what that does is that eliminates the whole life expectancy argument. So if 5 people are sitting in the room and you got a 25-year-old, a 35-year-old, a 55-year-old, and a 95-year-old, everybody's going to get the exact same tax deduction because it's good that we all know when it's going to go to charity. And in those types of trusts, a 10 to 12-year trust is really nice, because when you have that shorter time period, you could really bump up the distribution from the trust from 5% to 7, 8, 9%. and still get a pretty heavy tax deduction for it. And if you say, well, okay, but if my client's 75 years old, why would you want to do a 15-year or 12-year trust? Well, because it's not about you anymore. It's about the length of the trust. So the income comes to me as long as I'm alive. But should I die before the trust ends in 15 years, that income continues to whoever I designate. It could be a spouse, it could be a child, it could be anyone. So term of years trusts really are great because they eliminate all of the guesswork.
Perfect. And you mentioned something earlier. There's an insurance component or potentially an insurance component to all of this. And I want to kick the scenario even further. Business owner sells the business, loves the idea of the charitable remainder trust, but the next generation, the kids, aren't too keen on the idea of this $1 million now missing from their potential inheritance. They had that earmarked for whatever it is. Given that $50,000, 5% in income coming off that $1 million, what can the business owner do to assuage those concerns and still be charitably inclined?
Well, it's a very competitive marketplace right now for life insurance, especially at older ages, because the marketplace is shifting to older ages. Boomers like me are 70% of the wealth in the country right now. So we've got all the money. So that's a pretty good marketplace to be in. So insurance companies have responded by designing really great insurance contract. Second to die policies payable on death of the second spouse are very good. So you would take some of the cash flow. Again, here's where the advisor comes in, because they can go out and shop the marketplace, put out 4 or 5 different companies that you want a second to die insurance policy, where the goal is the most death benefit I can get for the least amount of money, but it's got to be a permanent policy. You got to take the guesswork away. So you do that, and you put that policy in a trust, so it's out of the client's estate. And so some of the cash flow flows into the second to die policy. If it's $1 million trust and you can do $1 million policy, that's the best. Even if you do a $500,000, you're replacing at least the tax. But don't forget, they would have paid tax on this money had they inherited it. So there's some wiggle room in there, but I like to try to insure the whole thing. And then the money that replaces the charitable trust in the form of life insurance is tax-free, because it's life insurance, probate free, income tax free, in our state, inheritance tax free. And if it goes into a irrevocable life insurance trust, it'll be out of the estate tax free as well. So it's a tremendous picture.
Yeah, I mean, so it sounds like, okay, I'm going to walk through this very slowly and tell me if I'm getting anything wrong. I get the upfront capital gains tax deduction of whatever portion I put into the charitable remainder trust. A percentage of that, we're going to use 35%-ish just in the current environment, can be used to offset the capital gains paid on the sale of the stock outside of the charitable remainder trust. I get an income benefit from that trust over the course of the life of the trust. It can be a term of 10, 12, 20, or the life of the trustee. I can use that income, some of that income, to pay for a life insurance policy that will pay out tax-free upon my death, hopefully held in an irrevocable life insurance trust so that I don't run into estate tax issues, to my beneficiaries. Did I miss anything? I mean, it sounds too good to be true. And it goes to charity when all is said and done.
Well, you got to give it to charity. I mean, that's the trade-off. It's got to go to charity. And yes, okay, where does this thing begin to fall apart? Well, if you have an uninsurable donor, we got to deal with that. And again, dealing with people my age, things start to fall off. You start leaking oil, and sometimes you don't get insurance at the best rates, and you have to evaluate those types of things. But you could also insure other people too. You don't have to replace wealth. You could actually use the cash flow to build wealth. But the trade-off is there. Of course, you don't, once the money goes into a charitable remainder trust, it ain't coming out. It's an irrevocable trust. So that's probably the biggest trade-off is I'm not going to put $1 million into a charitable remainder trust and then 6 months from now want to buy a condo somewhere and try to take some money out. It's not coming out. It's all that comes out is the cash flow based on the formula that we that we create on the trust goes in, which is why, to your point earlier, you really want to hit these potential pitfalls and design situations with the client before anybody pulls the trigger. And you will find, and I've been doing this for a long, long time, and it's 90% of what I do for a living is the charitable part of the business. A lot of times people just can't pull the trigger. They just can't do it. I mean, everything sounds perfect, but I'm giving up. I'm irrevocably, you're getting, I got $10 million someplace else, but you're giving $1 million of that to charity and you're getting all these benefits, but you still can't pull the trigger. Well, that's okay then. You really don't have charitable intent, and walk away from it, because you're just going to be unhappy. But you'd be surprised how many people, with everything lines up perfectly, just can't pull the trigger on charitable remainder trusts, because it makes nothing but sense to do it, right?
And I wouldn't be surprised, because I see it all the time as well. It's really just a function. And you hit on it so bluntly. It's almost like people forget. They see all of the different mechanisms and the fancy, tax strategy. But when push comes to shove, the button that you're pushing is to irrevocably give away $1 million in this example, which leads me to a really important second part of the conversation. Is this only for the ultra rich?
Not the ultra rich. Actually, when you get to be the ultra rich, this doesn't even, they don't need to deal with this. But it's perfect for that, the top 5 to 10%, the people who pay all the taxes, that percentage of the population, which is pretty big part of the population, that's where it fits. Maybe, you want to look at your portfolio. You shouldn't be really messing around with this stuff unless you have 5 million-ish of assets, home investments, retirement assets. Should really be about the $5 million range. Then this makes sense to you, because setting up charitable remainder trusts for amounts under $100,000 also doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because there are fees you have to pay to your accountant. There are fees you're going to have to pay for an attorney to set one up. These are all very minuscule compared to the benefit. But if you do a trust for $50,000, $60,000, $70,000, you're just not going to get the bang for the buck. You really want to be 100 floor minimum. And actually, it should be pushing more toward the $500,000 to $1 million range.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And look, $5 million is a ton of money any way you slice and dice it. But
Yeah.
It really is. I think a lot of people think that this type of strategy is meant for the $100 million people. And, there are plenty of different tax strategies out there. But this is something that's really approachable to a lot of the clientele that we work with here in Northeast Ohio, whether it's business owners, former retired executives. It's something that a lot of people should be considering that maybe think it's out of their stratosphere.
Well, you hit a very important point. Again, that really ultra wealthy client, this doesn't have enough bells and whistles, nor do they need it to have bells and whistles. I mean, they're gonna do the wing on a hospital. They're gonna do other gifts. They maybe have their own foundation, but that next step down, the movers and shakers, that 5%, again, who pay 95% of our taxes. Wow, the impact that they have, this has for them, and that they could have on society, and the thought that they can do it with money that the government was going to take from them anyway. Oh my gosh, that's just like the best.
Now, the last thing I want to touch on, you mentioned it earlier, but to bring this thing full circle and I guess give it the biggest punch possible, donor advised funds, private family foundations, how can those make this even a sweeter deal for the donor?
That to me is the ultimate design. Why? Okay, the rule says you have to have charity at the end. That's the end. At the end of the rainbow, you have to give the money away to charity. Okay, so if it goes to, I went to a small college out here in Pennsylvania, Moravian University. If I want to give my money to Moravian University for my trust, they can go there and they'll give me a pat on the back and, but it's done. I can get the same bang for setting up the Charitable Remainder Trust by creating a donor advised fund or a family foundation. Now, I'll go to the family foundation first. A family foundation Cost a few bucks to create. But now you're on the board, your spouse is on the board, your kids are on the board, eventually your grandchildren will be on the board, and you get to discuss each year where the funds that are collected in that foundation, where the funds are going to go. You got to give away 5% of the net worth of the foundation, net asset value of the foundation each year. So you sit down each year and you decide where those funds are going to go, but it's a little bit expensive. So that better have $1 million in there.
Sure.
The next one is the donor advised fund. Donor advised funds are operate under as their own charitable entity, and you become a sub fund under the donor advised fund. So you can create a donor advised fund under the community foundation using what I said before, like a Schwab charitable or Fidelity charitable. They create their own donor advised funds, and then underneath that, they're costs almost nothing to create. The fees to maintain are small, very small fees, very competitive. And then once a year, you can sit down with that fund with your little group of you and your spouse and your kids, and you can tell the fund where you want to give your checks to, where you want to go. So again, the biggest benefit of all of a donor advised fund or a family foundation is that the money, instead of going out to charity, the money kind of recycles back to the family, and the family has to use it for charitable purposes, but you teach multi-generational philanthropy. And I want to leave you with this concept because I live this actually. Some people say use charitable remainder trusts, for the tax purposes. And yes, there's a lot of great tax incentives to it, state taxes and everything. But the real bang happens, and unfortunately you don't see it, but the real bang happens after you're gone. When, years after you're gone and your spouse is gone, this money is in the foundation and being used to give other scholarships or support other charitable organizations. And I say to people, you won't be remembered for your astute estate planning. I mean, the kids are not going to sit around 30 years from now and say, man, Pop was a genius. He avoided $212,000 in federal estate tax by doing this program. But 30 years from now, when they are deciding who gets that year's distribution from Pop's foundation, they'll know who you are. They'll know what you meant. They'll know what was important to you, and you will be remembered. I mean, it's just a nice way to look at the whole package coming full circle.
Dan Nigito, there's nothing better that I can add. That was a great note to end it on. I really appreciate it. I'm going to link your book in the show notes because after I saw you speak, I went out, I got a copy of it. Your writing style is blunt and hilarious, and you do a really good job of laying out the complex concepts. I still reference it from time to time, going back and looking at some of the nuances of the strategy. So thank you so much again, Dan.
My pleasure. Thank you for thinking of me. This has really been a lot of fun. I really enjoy this, obviously.
Price Discovery Money and Mindset is brought to you by Wernick Wealth Managers and Chagrin Valley Business Strategies. Opinions expressed by Jordan and guests are their own and do not represent investment advice, solicitation, or the like. For more information and resources referenced in this episode, be sure to check out the show notes. Thank you and see you next time.